I spent 50 years as an accountant, 50 years counting other people's money, watching their relationship with it, watching what it did to the people who had it, what it did to the people who chased it, what it did to the people who made it their primary measure of how well they were doing at the task of being alive. I am 86 years old, and the most important thing I learned across 50 years of watching money operate in human lives is also the simplest. Money is a terrible master and an excellent servant. As a servant, money is one of the most practically useful things a person can have. It buys time. It removes the specific, grinding anxiety of not having enough, which is a real and serious anxiety and not to be minimized. It gives children a foundation. It funds the work and the experiences and the contributions that would otherwise be impossible. As a servant in the role it was designed to perform, money is genuinely and unsentimental valuable. As a master, money is one of the most destructive forces I have ever watched operate in a human life. It narrows what matters. It replaces the question of what is meaningful with the question of what is profitable. It puts the person in the service of their own accumulation rather than their accumulation in the service of the person, so that they spend their days working for the number rather than the number working for them, running always toward a finish line that was never established and therefore never arrives. The wealthiest people I ever knew were not always the richest. Some of the richest people I knew were desperately poor in the ways that matter most, and some of the people with the most modest material circumstances were among the wealthiest human beings I have ever encountered, because they had understood, at some fundamental level, what the money was for. Let me tell you about Clifford. Clifford was a client of mine for 26 years. He was, when I first met him, in his mid-30s, a man of considerable energy and considerable intelligence who had correctly identified that the financial services industry of his era rewarded a specific combination of risk tolerance and attention to the movements of capital that he possessed in abundance. He was good at making money, very good, in ways that I, as his accountant, could track across decades with the particular clarity of someone who sees the numbers in their full context. And Clifford was, across those 26 years, one of the most chronically dissatisfied people I ever met. Not in dramatic ways, not in ways that produced breakdown or crisis or visible suffering, in the specific, persistent, deeply embedded way of a person who had established money as the primary measure of their success, and who therefore could never, by definition, succeed. Because money as a measure of success has no upper limit. There is always more. There is always someone with more. There is always a next level that, once reached, fails to deliver the satisfaction that the approach to it had promised. Clifford's number kept growing. His dissatisfaction kept pace with it. I watched him across 26 years miss his children's childhoods in the service of the number, miss the window of his own health and vitality, the decades in which physical freedom was available to him in the service of the number, missed the opportunity to become deeply acquainted with his own inner life and his own values and the question of what he actually wanted, because the number always provided a ready substitute for that harder inquiry. When Clifford was 63, his cardiologist told him something that I suspect his body had been telling him for years. He came to me shortly after with a question I had never heard him ask in 26 years of working together. He said, "How much do I actually need?" That question, arriving at 63 in the wake of a medical warning, was the most important financial question he had ever asked, and the answer when we worked through it together was considerably less than he had been accumulating toward. The number that was enough, truly enough, with specific definitions of what enough was a number he had passed years before. He had been working for a master he had already paid off, and he had not noticed. Now let me tell you about Vera. Vera was a client of mine for 15 years. She had, by any conventional financial measure, considerably less than Clifford. a successful small business that provided her with comfort, security, and enough flexibility to work on her own terms. She was not accumulating toward a large number. She had established early in her working life a very clear picture of what enough looked like for her, and she had built her financial decisions around serving that picture rather than exceeding it. What Vera had that Clifford did not, and the difference was visible to me in the quality of her attention in our annual meetings, in the specific ease with which she discussed money as a tool rather than a destination was a clear answer to the question Clifford did not ask until he was 63. She knew what the money was for. It was for the life. Not a specific number, not the largest possible accumulation. The life she wanted to live, maintained at the level she had decided was enough, with the surplus put to work for things she valued beyond her own comfort. Vera was not wealthy by conventional measure. She was among the wealthiest human beings I have ever known. Because she was in charge of the money was not in charge of her, and the difference, across a working life, was the difference between a life fully lived and a life in service of an unexamined number. 3 things, from 86 years of living and 50 years of watching what money does when it is in the wrong relationship with the person holding it. First, enough is a decision, not a number. This is the single most practically important financial insight I know, and it is almost never taught. Society tells you that enough is a threshold you will recognize when you cross it, that the accumulation will at some point produce the feeling of sufficiency you are working toward, that if you keep going, you will eventually arrive. You will not arrive, not through accumulation alone, not because the number will never be large enough, but because enough is not a fact about the size of the number. Enough is a decision about the relationship between the number and the life you are living. It requires you to answer the question Clifford did not ask until he was 63. What is the money actually for? What specific, named concrete things does the money need to enable, and what number specifically enables those things? Until that question is answered, no number is enough, and once it is answered, many people discover that a considerably smaller number than they have been pursuing is already enough, or nearly so. Make the decision. Name what enough looks like, not as a restriction, as a destination you can actually reach. Second, know what the money is for. This is the complement to the first lesson and the question that makes the first lesson possible to answer. Every financial decision you make is at some level an answer to the question of what the money is for. The problem is that most people answer this question implicitly and by default, through habit and through the accumulation instinct, without ever asking it explicitly. Ask it explicitly. What is the money for? Not in the abstract. In the specific. What experiences does it need to enable? What freedom does it need to buy? What security does it need to provide? And for what specific purpose? What work does it need to fund? What do you want to give? What do you want to leave? When you know what the money is for, every financial decision becomes considerably clearer. You are no longer optimizing for the largest possible number. You are building a specific tool for specific purposes. And the question is not whether the tool is the biggest possible tool. The question is whether it is the right tool, correctly sized, for the job it needs to do. Money in the service of a clearly articulated life is one of the most powerful resources a person can have. Money in the service of its own accumulation is a master that will never be satisfied and will consume whatever you feed it. Third, you work for the life, not the number. This is the thing I wish I had understood more clearly in the middle years of my own career. And yes, I had my own version of this lesson. I had my own periods of working for the number rather than working for the life. The reframe is simple. It is not easy because the habits and the culture and the incentives of a working life make the default direction the number, not the life. But the reframe is simple. The money is the instrument. The life is the point. The work is in service of the life through the instrument of money, not in service of the accumulation of money as an end in itself. When you work for the number, the question is always, how do I get more? When you work for the life, the question is, does the work I am doing produce the life I want to live? These are very different questions, and they produce very different lives. Clifford, at 63, had to dismantle 26 years of working for the number in order to ask what he actually wanted the life to look like. It took him several years, and it cost him some of the health he had spent working rather than living. He did it, eventually. He arrived eventually at a version of the life that was closer to what he had always wanted and further from the compulsive accumulation that had substituted for it. But 26 years of working for the number could not be fully undone. The children who had grown up largely without his full presence could not be made young again. The decade of health he had spent behind a desk, rather than in the world, could not be reclaimed. I am 86 years old. I spent 50 years watching what money does when it is in charge. The wealthiest people I knew were not always the richest. The most deeply impoverished people I knew were not always the ones with the least. The difference, in every case I can recall across 50 years, was the same. The wealthy ones, the ones who arrived at the end of their working lives with something that looked like fullness rather than accumulation, had answered the question early. They knew what the money was for. They had decided what enough looked like, and they had spent their working years building the life through the instrument of money rather than building the accumulation at the cost of the life. Money is an excellent servant. Give it a job. Define the job clearly. Pay it what the job requires. And then, when the job is done, do not let it invent a new one. You are the master of it, not the other way.